I was 7 years old when my world shifted, though I wouldn't understand just how much until years later. At the time, I believed I was like any other child, loved, acknowledged, and part of a family that functioned in the way families were supposed to. I had no reason to question the warmth in my mother's smile or the way my father ruffled my hair as he walked past. Life was predictable, secure, and filled with the kind of little joys that make childhood feel endless. That all changed the day my sister, Sophia, was born. She came too early, a frail thing barely larger than a loaf of bread, wrapped in wires and tubes that seemed too big for her tiny body. The hospital room was cold, the kind of sterile environment meant to keep death at bay, but it clung to the air like a whisper. My mother cried, out of fear, out of relief, I wasn't sure. My father held her hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. No one noticed me standing there, clutching the stuffed bear I had brought as a gift for the baby I was so eager to meet. The weeks that followed blurred into a routine of hushed voices, careful movements, and an ever-present tension that coated the walls of our home like fresh paint. My parents were consumed by Sophia's fragile existence, their every thought revolving around her survival. And me? I was an afterthought. At first, I didn't mind. I was young enough to understand that my baby sister needed them more than I did. I told myself it was temporary, that once Sophia grew stronger, things would return to normal. I tried to help, offering to bring my mother tea or drawing pictures to make her smile. She would take them absent-mindedly, thanking me without really looking, her gaze fixed on the baby monitor beside her. Soon, I learned that my presence only seemed to be an inconvenience. I heard it in the way my mother's voice changed when she spoke to me, gentle but distracted, as if she were speaking out of obligation rather than love. I saw it in my father's sigh when I tried to show him my schoolwork, his eyes shifting past me as if I weren't really there. The first time I truly felt invisible was on my 8th birthday. I woke up early, excitement buzzing through me as I tiptoed downstairs, expecting the usual decorations and the scent of my mother's homemade pancakes. Instead, the house was silent, save for the hum of the oxygen machine in Sophia's room. My presents sat unopened on the dining table, forgotten beneath a pile of medical papers. No one even realized what day it was until my grandmother arrived that afternoon, holding a small cake with my name written in delicate cursive icing. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she said, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. My mother looked up from where she sat on the couch, exhaustion deepening the lines on her face. "Oh, Olivia, I'm so sorry," she murmured, guilt flickering in her eyes for a moment before she turned her attention back to Sophia. That was when I understood. I was no longer the priority. The shift was slow but undeniable. The Olivia who had once been the center of her parents' world became a shadow that moved through the house, unnoticed unless she made herself useful. I stopped asking for bedtime stories. I stopped reaching for my father's hand when we crossed the street. I stopped trying. It didn't take long for loneliness to settle in, wrapping around me like an old sweater, familiar and worn. As Sophia grew older, the imbalance only deepened. She was fragile, our mother constantly reminded me, her immune system weak and her body not as strong as mine. Everything revolved around ensuring her safety, sanitizing every surface, limiting visitors, and canceling plans at the last minute whenever Sophia so much as sneezed. I learned to expect disappointment. My school play, where I had landed the lead role, was missed because Sophia had a fever. The art competition I worked so hard for was overshadowed by Sophia's first time eating solid food. Even the smallest victories, aces on spelling tests, awards for academic excellence, were brushed aside with murmured praise before my parents returned to tending to my sister. The worst part was that Sophia learned to weaponize their attention. She was clever in a way that made me uneasy, a child who quickly understood that tears could shift the tide in her favor. If she didn't want to share a toy, she would pout, her lower lip trembling just enough to draw our mother's concern. If she was asked to do something she disliked, she would clutch her chest dramatically, claiming she felt too weak to move. It was always the same. My parents would rush to her side, fussing over her as if she were made of glass. And me? I was expected to understand, to be patient, to sacrifice. By the time I was 10, I had mastered the art of making myself small. I spent more time at my grandmother's house, a haven of old books and soft music, where I wasn't constantly reminded that I was less important. My grandmother noticed the change in me, the way my shoulders hunched slightly, the way my smiles never quite reached my eyes. "You are not invisible, Olivia," she told me one evening as we sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "And one day, you'll prove it to them." I wanted to believe her. But as I stared into the flickering flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had already been erased from my own family's story. And the worst part? No one seemed to notice. The house I once knew had transformed into something unrecognizable. The warmth, the casual clutter of a lived-in home, the scent of my mother's cooking, all of it had vanished. In its place stood a pristine fortress, where every surface gleamed, every room smelled of disinfectant, and every action revolved around one rule: protect Sophia. At first, I thought it was temporary. That eventually, things would return to normal, and I'd be allowed to exist without feeling like an outsider in my own home. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into years, and the fortress only grew stronger. My mother was the commander of this new world. She kept strict rules, wiping down doorknobs with obsessive precision, banning shoes inside the house, and limiting visitors to only those who were deemed safe. She monitored Sophia's every move, logging her meals, tracking her temperature, and hovering over her as if willing her to stay unbreakable. I became an inconvenience. It wasn't said outright, but I felt it in every glance, every sigh, every moment I was sent away. If I so much as sneezed, my mother would immediately usher me out the door, calling my grandmother to come and collect me. "It's just a precaution, Olivia," she would say, her tone gentle but firm. "You understand, don't you?" At first, I nodded. Of course, I understood. Sophia was fragile. Sophia needed protection. But after the third, fourth, 10th time of being sent away at the slightest hint of a cough, I began to wonder if this was really about protecting Sophia or if it was about removing me. Being at my grandmother's house was never a punishment, at least not in the way my mother probably thought. It was a sanctuary, a place where I wasn't constantly reminded that I was secondary. My grandmother, Margaret, had an old Victorian home filled with oddities, antique clocks, porcelain figurines, and shelves upon shelves of books. She never treated me as though I were a risk. Instead, she welcomed me with open arms, brewing chamomile tea and wrapping me in warm quilts, as if to reassure me that I still belong somewhere. "Your mother means well," she would say, watching me with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "She's just lost in all of this." But I wasn't sure that was true. Because it wasn't just the sickness that set me apart. It was everything. My grades, straight A's, academic awards, essay contests won, were acknowledged with distracted nods, while Sophia's ability to count to 10 was met with beaming pride. My drawings, once displayed on the fridge, were now stuffed into a drawer, forgotten beneath stacks of Sophia's medical records. Even the way I spoke, the things I was interested in, seemed to irritate my parents. "Olivia, must you always correct people?" my mother sighed one afternoon after I pointed out a historical inaccuracy in a movie. "It's exhausting." Yet when Sophia mispronounced a word, they laughed as if it were the most charming thing in the world. I learned to hold my tongue. I learned that my achievements, my thoughts, my very presence didn't matter as much as hers. Sophia was always watching. She was young, but she wasn't stupid. She saw the way our parents treated me, the way they brushed me aside without a second thought. And she used it. It started small, little manipulations that only I seemed to notice. She would claim exhaustion whenever she didn't want to do something, feigning weakness just enough to gain sympathy. If she wanted a toy I was playing with, she would pout, saying, "But I don't feel good," and immediately, my mother would tell me to give it to her. By the time she was 6, she had mastered the art of getting exactly what she wanted. I remember one particular afternoon when I had built a tower out of blocks, tall, balanced, perfect. Sophia watched me from across the room, her eyes narrowed with a calculating look far too mature for her face. Then, without a word, She stumbled toward the tower, knocking it over with a dramatic gasp. I stared at the scattered blocks, anger flaring in my chest. Why did you do that? Tears welled in her eyes instantly, her lower lip trembling. I tripped, she whispered, voice quivering. Our mother rushed in at the sound of her sniffles. What happened? Sophia knocked over my tower, I said, my frustration clear. I didn't mean to, Sophia sniffled, casting a pitiful glance at our mother. And just like that, I became the villain. Olivia, she's younger than you, my mother scolded, her voice edged with disappointment. You need to be more understanding. Understanding. That word followed me everywhere. I needed to be understanding when Sophia got special treatment. I needed to be understanding when my needs were ignored. I needed to be understanding when I was punished for things that weren't my fault. The realization came slowly, like a puzzle clicking into place. I wasn't being cared for. I was being tolerated. I was being treated as a risk, a problem to be managed. And worst of all, no one even saw it. The final straw came when I overheard my parents talking one night. I had been lying awake in my room, staring at the ceiling when their voices drifted through the thin walls. Olivia's always at Margaret's, my father said. It's almost like she lives there. She's happier there, my mother replied, her tone dismissive. And it's easier for everyone. Easier. That word echoed in my head, bitter and sharp. They weren't sending me away for my sake. They were sending me away for theirs. I clenched my fists beneath my blanket, a slow-burning anger settling in my chest. I wasn't sick. I wasn't fragile. I wasn't some burden to be cast aside whenever it was convenient. I mattered, even if they refused to see it. From that moment on, something inside me hardened. I stopped trying to earn their attention. I stopped showing them my schoolwork, stopped waiting for their approval, stopped hoping that one day they would look at me the way they looked at Sophia. Instead, I turned inward. I spent more time at my grandmother's house, losing myself in books, in knowledge, in the quiet understanding that I was worth more than the way they treated me. And as I watched Sophia grow bolder in her manipulations, watched my parents continue to fall for every one of her carefully crafted lies, I made a silent promise to myself. One day I would leave. And when I did, I wouldn't look back. My grandmother's house became my true home long before I officially left my parents' house. It was a place of stability, of warmth, of quiet conversations that weren't laced with obligation or condescension. Margaret was the only one who saw me, not as a risk, not as a problem, but as a person. She treated me as if I had value, and after years of being overlooked, that meant everything. Her house smelled of lavender and old books, a comforting blend that felt more welcoming than any embrace my mother had given me in years. I spent most of my afternoons there, sitting cross-legged on her thick Persian rugs while she told me stories of the past. Not the fairy tales my mother had once read to me before Sophia was born, no, these were different. These were real stories, filled with history, survival, and a kind of resilience that I longed to possess. You remind me of your great-grandmother, she said one evening, handing me a delicate gold locket. She had the same fire in her. I held the locket carefully, feeling the cool metal against my palm. What was she like? Margaret smiled, her eyes distant with memory. Brilliant. Determined. She had an eye for treasures. This locket? She found it in a market stall, recognized its true worth, and later sold it for 10 times what she paid. That's how she started her business. She built an empire out of nothing. The idea stuck with me, lodging itself into my mind like a seed waiting to grow. I had spent my life feeling invisible, my achievements dismissed while Sophia was praised for doing the bare minimum. But here, in my grandmother's stories, I saw a different future. A future where intelligence and hard work mattered. A future where I wasn't overshadowed by someone else's needs. I started spending more time in my grandmother's study, poring over old books about antique jewelry, art history, and authentication techniques. The details fascinated me, how simple engraving could reveal a piece's origins, how the weight of gold could distinguish real from counterfeit, how every gemstone had a story embedded within its facets. Margaret noticed my growing interest and nurtured it. She would bring out her collection of old jewelry, letting me examine each piece, teaching me the tricks she had learned from years of experience. "Pay attention to the craftsmanship," she instructed one evening as she handed me an antique brooch. "Mass-produced pieces lack detail. Look at the edges, the clasp, the way the stones are set." I traced my fingers over the intricate filigree, noting the tiny imperfections that hinted at its handcrafted origin. "This wasn't made in a factory," I said slowly, piecing it together. She nodded in approval. "Good eye." For the first time in my life, I felt seen. It became an obsession. I spent every spare moment learning, devouring information like a starving person at a feast. My schoolwork, already stellar, became even more precise, fueled by a new sense of purpose. I didn't just want to succeed, I needed to. At home, my parents barely noticed my shift in focus. They were too wrapped up in Sophia, in her endless demands and carefully crafted helplessness. She had perfected the art of manipulation, twisting every situation to suit her needs. If she wanted something, all she had to do was pout, let her voice waver just enough, and my parents would fall over themselves to accommodate her. The contrast was infuriating. One evening, I overheard my mother on the phone, speaking to another parent. "Oh, Sophia's so bright," she gushed. "She's reading full sentences now. We're so proud of her." I stood in the hallway, gripping my textbook so tightly that my knuckles ached. Just that afternoon, I had won first place in a regional essay competition. No one in my family had even acknowledged it. Sophia walked past me then, a smug smile on her lips, as if she knew exactly what I was thinking. "You're so serious all the time," she said, tilting her head. "Maybe if you smiled more, Mom and Dad would like you better." I turned away before she could see the anger flash across my face. That was the moment I knew for certain I had to get out. Escape wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a necessity. I doubled down on my studies, channeling every ounce of my frustration into my education. I refused to be invisible. By the time I was in high school, I was top of my class, my grades perfect, my SAT scores flawless. I had no doubt that I could get into any college I wanted, but I had my sights set on one, the University of Pennsylvania. It was far enough from home that I could disappear into a new life, yet prestigious enough to secure my future. When my acceptance letter arrived, along with a full-ride scholarship, I held the envelope in my hands for a long time, letting the weight of it sink in. This was it. Proof that I was more than the role my family had forced upon me. I walked into the kitchen, where my parents were sitting with Sophia. I placed the letter on the table. "I got into Penn," I said, my voice steady. My father glanced at the letter, nodded absently, and went back to his coffee. My mother smiled briefly but didn't even open the envelope. "That's nice, Olivia," she said. "Nice." Sophia, lounging on a chair with her legs tucked beneath her, smirked. "Wow! Guess that means you'll finally stop lurking around here." Something inside me cracked. I exhaled slowly, then turned and walked away. I didn't slam the door, didn't yell. I didn't need to. Their indifference spoke louder than any words I could say. Later that night, my grandmother pulled me into a hug, her grip firm. "I knew you'd make it," she whispered. "They may not see you, but I do." Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. This was just the beginning. I would go to Penn. I would build a life for myself. And one day, I would be so successful that they would regret every single moment they had dismissed me. The moment I stepped onto the University of Pennsylvania's campus, I knew I had made the right decision. The air felt different here, charged with ambition, buzzing with possibility. No one knew me as Olivia, the forgotten daughter, the inconvenient older sister. Here, I was simply Olivia Carter, a student with a future entirely in my own hands. I had never had that kind of control before. My parents barely reacted when I packed my bags and left. There were no tearful goodbyes, no heartfelt words of encouragement. My mother gave me a distracted hug, already preoccupied with scheduling Sophia's next doctor's appointment. My father nodded and muttered, "Work hard." Sophia barely looked up from her phone. "Don't be too boring," she said with a smirk. "Or do. Whatever." And just like that, I was free. The first few weeks at Penn were exhilarating and terrifying all at once. I had spent years preparing for this, excelling academically, planning my escape, but nothing had prepared me for the sheer independence of it all. No one monitored my every move. No one cared if I came home late from the library or spent hours buried in my books. There were no whispered conversations about how I needed to be understanding, or the constant background noise of Sophia's demands. I had never realized how heavy my home life had been until I was no longer carrying it. I threw myself into my studies, majoring in art history with a focus on antiquities. It was the perfect blend of my passion for jewelry authentication and my love for history. Every lecture felt like uncovering a hidden world. While other students struggled to find their footing, I thrived. I aced my exams, participated in research projects, and spent late nights in the library absorbing every bit of knowledge I could. Unlike at home, where my accomplishments had been dismissed, here they mattered. Professors recognized my talent. Peers respected my knowledge. But it wasn't just about academics. For the first time in my life, I made friends, not out of necessity, but because I actually wanted to. There was Hannah, my outspoken, fiercely intelligent roommate who never let anyone underestimate her. She was majoring in business and had a knack for turning the simplest ideas into lucrative ventures. Then there was Liam, a fellow art history major with a sharp wit and an encyclopedic knowledge of Renaissance jewelry. We bonded over our mutual love for lost artifacts, spending hours debating historical mysteries. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was living, breaking into the industry. During my sophomore year, I landed an internship at a prestigious auction house in New York. It was everything I had dreamed of: polished mahogany desks, gloved hands handling priceless artifacts, whispered conversations about multi-million-dollar pieces. I spent my days cataloging jewelry, inspecting gemstones, and absorbing every detail I could from the experts around me. While some interns struggled to keep up, I thrived. Years of being ignored had taught me how to observe without being noticed, how to pick up on the smallest details that others missed. One afternoon, while organizing a collection of vintage brooches, I noticed something odd about a particular piece. It had been catalogued as a reproduction, a well-made but ultimately worthless imitation of a Victorian design. But something didn't sit right with me. The metalwork was too intricate, the wear patterns too precise. I studied it for hours, comparing it to documented antiques, until I was certain. This wasn't a reproduction. It was a forgotten treasure. Nervous but determined, I approached my supervisor, a senior appraiser known for his no-nonsense approach. "I think this brooch is misidentified," I said, carefully laying out my research. He arched an eyebrow but humored me, examining the piece under a jeweler's loupe. Silence stretched between us as he studied it, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he set it down and nodded. "You're right. The brooch, once dismissed as a fake, was reappraised and sold for $42,000. And I was no longer just an intern. I was an expert in the making. The first taste of success. By the time I graduated, I had job offers from some of the most prestigious auction houses in the country. I chose one that specialized in rare jewelry, eager to expand my expertise. I worked harder than anyone, proving myself over and over again. Every piece I authenticated, every undervalued treasure I uncovered, added to my reputation. But the more I succeeded, the more I realized something: working for others had its limits. No matter how skilled I was still answering to someone else. I was making their business money, growing their reputation, following their rules. And after years of being invisible, I wanted something of my own. That seed of ambition, planted by my grandmother all those years ago, finally took root. I started researching, building a plan. I didn't have wealthy connections or family support, but I had knowledge. And knowledge, in the right hands, was more valuable than gold. I saved every penny I could, living frugally, sacrificing luxuries while I built my dream. And then, after years of preparation, I did it. I walked into my boss's office, handed in my resignation, and walked out with nothing but my expertise and the determination to succeed. Building an empire. Starting my own jewelry authentication business wasn't easy. I didn't have a fancy office or a team of experts. In the beginning, it was just me, a laptop, and a magnifying glass in a tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper. I took small jobs, verifying heirlooms for private clients, consulting on estate sales, authenticating engagement rings for nervous buyers. Word spread. Slowly, my reputation grew. Then, one day, a high-profile client reached out. A collector who had inherited a vast jewelry collection but needed someone with a sharp eye to determine its true value. It was my chance. I spent weeks examining each piece, uncovering hidden markings, tracing their histories. When the auction day arrived, the collection. Starting my own business had been the biggest risk of my life, but it was also the best decision I had ever made. What started as a small, one-woman operation quickly grew into something far bigger than I had ever imagined. My name became known among collectors, investors, and auction houses, and my expertise became a valuable asset in the high-stakes world of antique jewelry authentication. At first, I operated out of my tiny apartment, working long hours under the dim glow of my desk lamp, meticulously inspecting every piece that came my way. Clients started small, people looking to verify their grandmother's pearls or confirm whether a family heirloom was worth anything. But as word spread about my accuracy and sharp eye for details, wealthier clients began to seek me out. Within the first year, I had authenticated pieces that were worth more than I had ever dreamed of handling. A Cartier bracelet from the 1920s, a diamond tiara that had belonged to European royalty, a forgotten Art Nouveau pendant, originally dismissed as costume jewelry, that turned out to be worth over $100,000. Each success built my reputation further, cementing me as one of the most trusted voices in the field. But the real turning point came when a high-profile collector contacted me for a massive project, a $650,000 jewelry collection that needed authentication before going to auction. I remember the moment clearly, sitting in a sleek Manhattan office, staring at the rows of velvet-lined cases, each filled with pieces dripping in diamonds, sapphires, and emeralds. The air smelled of polished wood and old money, and for the first time, I felt the weight of what I had built. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't some side gig. This was my empire. I spent weeks poring over the collection, studying the craftsmanship, cross-referencing archives, and verifying every stone and setting. The night before the auction, I barely slept, my mind running through every possible scenario. Had I missed something? Had I made a mistake? But when the gavel came down and the collection sold for its full worth, my confidence was solidified. My commission check, $65,000, was the proof I had been waiting for. It wasn't just about the money. It was about knowing that I had done this. I had built something out of nothing, growing beyond expectations. After that sale, everything changed. My client list expanded, bringing in wealthy collectors, celebrities, and high-profile investors who wanted my expertise before making million-dollar purchases. The demand grew so fast that I had no choice but to hire a small team, 2 experts in gemology, and a business assistant to help me manage inquiries. Within 2 years, I had opened offices in Los Angeles and Miami, securing my company's place in the luxury jewelry world. My name was spoken in the same breath as industry veterans, and I found myself attending exclusive galas, networking with the elite, and handling pieces that had once been locked away in museums or royal vaults. And yet, despite all my success, my family remained oblivious. My mother and father still assumed I was working in some small antique shop, casually tinkering with old jewelry. They had never asked for details, never inquired about my business, and I had never offered. Sophia, of course, had made occasional snide comments in passing. Still playing with old jewelry, she had smirked once during a rare phone call. I had only smiled. Something like that. There was something liberating about knowing they had no idea who I had become. They had dismissed me for years, never bothering to see my worth. Now, I was living a life beyond anything they could comprehend, and they remained as unaware as ever. But that ignorance wouldn't last forever. An unwanted Thanksgiving invitation. It had been years since I had last spent a holiday with my family, but when my mother called and invited me to Thanksgiving, something in her tone was different. "We'd love to have you here, Olivia," she said, her voice unusually soft. "It's been too long." I hesitated. I had spent so long distancing myself from them that the idea of walking back into their world felt strange. But a small part of me, the part that still craved closure, wondered if maybe, just maybe, things had changed. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. I didn't just show up, though. I wanted to make a statement. I had the entire dinner catered by a Michelin-starred chef, ensuring that every dish was perfect, every detail flawless. I spared no expense, arranging for an elegant dining setup, complete with imported wines and a dessert spread that could rival any high-end restaurant. The moment I arrived, Sophia rolled her eyes. "Really, Olivia? This is a bit much, don't you think?" I ignored her, greeting my parents as they fussed over the meal, clearly overwhelmed by the luxury of it all. For the first time in years, I almost felt like I belonged, like maybe this was an opportunity to start over. And then Sophia found my laptop. The moment everything changed. I had left it open on the dining table while stepping away for a moment, unaware that Sophia, ever the opportunist, had taken an interest. When I returned, she was standing there, scrolling through my financial records, her expression frozen in disbelief. $8 million, she whispered, her voice laced with shock. The room went silent. My mother's eyes widened. My father, who had been mid-conversation, turned toward me with an expression I had never seen before. "Olivia," he said slowly, "is this real?" I exhaled, forcing myself to remain calm. "Yes." Sophia let out a laugh, sharp, incredulous. "You've been sitting on millions while we've been struggling? And you never thought to help your family?" I clenched my jaw. "I have helped." My mother blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" I looked directly at Sophia. "The $5,000 per month I've been sending to help with household expenses? The money you took credit for?" Her face paled. My parents turned to her, confusion shifting into something else, something close to betrayal. You said that was from your job," my mother stammered. Sophia's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I had spent my entire life being overlooked, dismissed, treated as less than. But in that moment, I held all the power. And I wasn't about to give it back. "You want to talk about obligations?" I said, my voice steady. For years, I was treated like an afterthought. I was sent away, ignored, dismissed. And now that you know I have money, you suddenly think I owe you something? My father's face turned red. "We are your family, Olivia. Families support each other." I let out a humorless laugh. "Funny. I don't remember getting that kind of support when I needed it." Sophia scoffed. "You're being selfish." I met her gaze, unflinching. "No. I'm finally putting myself first." And with that, I picked up my coat, turned on my heel, and walked away. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. I didn't look back as I walked out of my parents' house that night. The cold autumn air hit me as I stepped outside, but I barely felt it. My mind was still reeling from everything that had just happened. Sophia's betrayal, my parents' outrage, the sheer audacity of their entitlement. For years, I had been overlooked, ignored, pushed aside. But the moment they discovered my wealth, I became valuable to them. Not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as a bank account. I should have expected it. And maybe, deep down, I had. As I drove back to my penthouse, the city lights flashing past, I felt something unexpected, relief. For the first time, I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to minimize my success, downplay my accomplishments, or pretend I was still the girl they had dismissed. I was done. The fallout begins. The next morning, my phone was flooded with messages. My mother had texted, alternating between guilt-tripping and scolding. "Olivia, we need to talk. This is not how family treats each other. I don't understand how you could be so selfish after everything we've done for you." My father's messages were shorter, but just as infuriating. "We raised you better than this. Family comes first. You owe us at least that much." And then there was Sophia. Her messages dripped with venom. "Wow, you really think you're better than us now, huh? You're a joke, Olivia. All that money and still no one actually likes you. Hope you enjoy being alone with your stupid jewelry." I didn't respond. I let them stew in their own frustration, their own anger. Let them realize that they no longer had any control over me. And that silence drove them insane. Public humiliation attempt. It didn't take long before Sophia took her grievances public. A few days later, I logged onto social media to find that she had posted a long, dramatic message about how her selfish millionaire sister had abandoned her family. She painted herself as the victim, of course. Growing up, I always looked up to my sister, even when she pushed me aside. But now, after everything we've been through, I see who she really is. Money changed her. She abandoned the people who loved her most. Family means nothing to her anymore. The comments poured in. Some were sympathetic to her, others questioned her motives. But I didn't care. Because the people who actually mattered, they knew the truth. The jewelry industry's response. To my surprise, my silence only worked in my favor. In my world, the high-stakes world of luxury jewelry authentication, reputation was everything. And while Sophia thought she was ruining mine, she was actually strengthening it. Investors, clients, and collectors respected independence. They admired those who built something on their own, without handouts or shortcuts. When word got around that I had cut off my entitled family, my standing in the industry only grew. Clients saw me as someone who couldn't be manipulated. Someone who made decisions based on expertise, not sentiment. Someone who was in control. More high-profile clients sought me out, trusting me even more with their rarest, most valuable pieces. While my family tried to paint me as selfish, the world I actually cared about saw me as powerful. And I wasn't about to correct them. Sophia's pathetic attempt at competition. It wasn't long before Sophia decided she wanted a piece of my success. She had always been good at getting what she wanted, manipulating people into bending to her will. But in the real world, outside of our parents' bubble, her tactics didn't work as well. I first heard about her so-called business through a former colleague. Did you see this? Hannah, my old college roommate, sent me a link one afternoon. It was a website, a poorly designed, half-finished website, advertising Sophia Carter jewelry authentication services. I stared at the screen, then let out a short, humorless laugh. She was trying to do what I did. But unlike me, she had no expertise, no credentials, no real knowledge. Just the assumption that if her big sister could do it, then she could too. I wasn't even worried. Because within a month, it crumbled. Clients quickly saw through her lies. She misidentified pieces, overvalued worthless trinkets, and made amateur mistakes that cost buyers thousands. A few bad reviews turned into a flood of complaints. Her reputation? Destroyed before it even began. And the best part? I didn't have to lift a finger. She had done it to herself. Cutting them off completely. Despite everything, my family still tried to get through to me. When their guilt trips failed, when Sophia's public tantrum didn't work, they resorted to full-blown begging. My mother called, leaving a voicemail filled with forced tears. "We're struggling, Olivia. We just need a little help. Just until things get better." My father tried the disappointed but firm approach. "You can't just abandon your family like this. We're still your parents." And Sophia? She went back to insults. "You think money makes you powerful? You're nothing without us." But the difference now was that I didn't care. I had spent my entire life trying to be seen by them, trying to prove my worth. And for what? They had never truly valued me, only what I could give them. So, I made my final move. I changed my number, blocked them on every platform, closed every door they could use to reach me. And just like that, they were gone. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bound by their expectations, their demands, their manipulations. I was free, and it was the most powerful feeling in the world. Cutting my family off was supposed to bring me peace. And in many ways, it did. The constant pressure, the nagging texts, the guilt-laced phone calls, they all disappeared overnight. My life was mine again, no longer dictated by people who had spent years treating me like an afterthought. But I had underestimated one thing. Desperate people don't just give up. They claw, they scheme, they manipulate. And my family was no exception. The barrage of manipulation. At first, it was just more of the same, calls and messages from unknown numbers, emails disguised as innocent inquiries. I ignored them all. But then the tactics shifted. Sophia took her sob story to social media once again, only this time, she got more creative. She posted pictures of my parents looking weary and defeated, captioning them with heart-wrenching pleas. Our family is falling apart. We've lost everything. I never thought my own sister would turn her back on us like this. Money changed her. She forgot where she came from. Please, if anyone can reach her, tell Olivia that family should come first. The comments flooded in. People sympathizing with her. Strangers condemning me. Even old acquaintances from high school, people I hadn't spoken to in years, messaged me asking how I could be so heartless. I blocked them all. Then came the public interviews. Sophia went to the local news, crafting a sob story about how her, once close, sister had abandoned their struggling family. She painted my success as something I had achieved at their expense, twisting the narrative to make it sound like I had selfishly hoarded wealth while they barely scraped by. It was laughable, especially considering that I had sent them money for years. But the worst part? She knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just trying to guilt me. She was trying to destroy my reputation, hoping that enough pressure would force me to cave. What she didn't realize was that I had been preparing for this moment my entire life. I had spent years being ignored, dismissed, treated as less than. But now I was untouchable. Silence is louder than words. I refused to engage. I didn't issue a statement. I didn't defend myself online. I didn't counter her claims with evidence. I simply carried on. And that silence? It drove her crazy. The more I ignored her, the more desperate she became. She tried to get my business partners involved, reaching out to industry professionals with fabricated concerns about my ethics. But my reputation was already solid. No one bought her lies. Instead, investors and clients admired my restraint. You handled that beautifully, one of my clients told me at a private auction event. People who fight back usually look guilty. You? You look like someone who doesn't even consider them a threat. And that was exactly what I wanted. Sophia could scream into the void all she wanted. I had already won. Her pathetic attempt at competition, again. Of course, Sophia wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. After failing to bring me down, she decided to try something even more ridiculous. She attempted to rebrand herself as a jewelry expert. I almost laughed when I saw the website. This time, she wasn't just offering authentication services, she was trying to position herself as an influencer in the luxury jewelry space. Posting badly written articles about gemstone trends, making uninformed predictions about the market, even offering consultations to people who didn't know any better. It was embarrassing. And predictably, it flopped. No real collectors took her seriously. Within months, her website was a graveyard of half-finished blog posts and unanswered inquiries. She had tried to steal my success, just like she had stolen my parents' attention all those years ago. And just like before, she had failed. Expanding my empire. While Sophia floundered, I thrived. My business was growing faster than I had ever imagined. High-profile clients came to me before making major purchases, valuing my judgment above all else. I expanded into new markets, securing contracts with auction houses across Europe and Asia. I was no longer just an expert in authentication. I was the expert. With that success came financial freedom on a level I had never experienced. I moved into a luxury penthouse, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Every inch of it felt like a testament to how far I had come. I traveled, Paris for antique markets, Milan for high-profile auctions, Tokyo for exclusive collector events. I met people who had built legacies, who respected my knowledge, who saw me as an equal. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And for the first time in my life, I was truly happy. The final desperate move. Just when I thought my family had finally accepted defeat, they pulled one last stunt. They showed up. I was in my office, finalizing the details of a deal when my assistant buzzed in. "Miss Carter," she said hesitantly, "there are People here asking to see you. They say they're your family. I stiffened. It had been months since I last spoke to any of them. I had expected more emails, more public outbursts, but this was new. Send security, I said flatly. She hesitated. They seem desperate. I sighed, debating whether to have them removed immediately. But then, curiosity got the better of me. Let them in, I said. But make sure someone else is in the room. Moments later, my parents and Sophia walked in. They looked different. Weaker. My mother's face was drawn, my father's shoulders slumped. Sophia, usually smug and self-assured, had lost some of her bravado. Olivia, my mother started, we need your help. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. Help. Sophia huffed. Look, we get it. You're mad. But we're family. And families are supposed to support each other. I stared at them, unblinking. You mean like how you supported me? Silence. My father cleared his throat. We made mistakes, but we're struggling. We just need a little. No, I interrupted. They blinked. My mother forced a shaky smile. Olivia, sweetheart, please, we just. I said no. Sophia's face twisted with frustration. You're really just going to sit there and do nothing while we suffer? Yes, I said simply. She inhaled sharply, as if I had slapped her. You're a monster. I smiled. And you're desperate. Desperate enough to finally admit that you need me. But the thing is, I don't need you. My father clenched his jaw. You're going to regret this. No, I said, standing. I won't. Then, I pressed the intercom button. Escort them out. Security arrived within moments, guiding my family toward the exit as they sputtered protests, throwing last-ditch attempts at guilt my way. I didn't care, because as the doors shut behind them, I knew the truth. I had broken free. For good. I sat in my office for a long time after my family was escorted out. The silence felt heavier than usual, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was final. I had waited years for this moment, to be the one in control, to stand my ground, to refuse them the power they had once held over me. I had imagined this confrontation in 100 different ways, thought about all the things I would say to them if given the chance. And yet, when the moment came, it had been surprisingly easy. No yelling, no long speeches, just a simple, undeniable fact. They needed me, and I didn't need them. The aftermath. I expected more fallout, more public tantrums, more attempts to guilt me through social media. But for the first time, Sophia stayed quiet. Maybe she had finally realized she had lost. Or maybe she was planning her next move. I didn't care either way. With my family officially out of my life, I turned my full attention to my business. There were deals to negotiate, auctions to prepare for, high-profile clients who depended on my expertise. Every day, I handled pieces worth more than my parents' house, consulted on collections that spanned centuries. I was no longer just a jewelry authenticator. I was a force in the industry. My name carried weight. Auction houses consulted me before major sales. Collectors trusted my judgment more than they trusted their own instincts. And competitors? They watched from a distance, trying to figure out how I had risen so quickly. The answer was simple. I had spent my entire life fighting to be seen. And now, the world had no choice but to see me. The call I didn't expect. Weeks passed, and my family's absence became just another part of my new reality. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang. I almost ignored it. The number wasn't familiar, and I had no interest in dealing with surprise calls. But something made me answer. Olivia? I froze. It was my grandmother. Margaret had never been one to get involved in family drama. She had always supported me, quietly watching from the sidelines as I built my own life. But she had never taken sides. Never called to tell me I was right or wrong. So why was she calling now? Grandma? My voice was cautious. She sighed, the weight of something unspoken in her breath. I heard what happened. I exhaled. I should have called you. I needed space. I know, she said. And I don't blame you. A pause stretched between us. Then she said, I'm proud of you, Olivia. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening in a way I hadn't expected. Margaret had always been the only one who truly saw me. The only one who had ever believed I could be more than just the forgotten daughter. Hearing her say those words now, after everything, meant more than I could put into words. "Thank you," I said quietly. She hesitated. "Your parents, they're struggling." I stiffened. "I know. I'm not asking you to help them," she clarified. "I just thought you should know. They never expected you to walk away." "Not really. And now, they don't know what to do without you." I didn't respond. Because I already knew the answer. They would find someone else to depend on. Someone else to manipulate. They always did. A life of my own. After hanging up with my grandmother, I took a long walk through the city. The air was crisp, the streets buzzing with life, but I felt strangely detached from it all. I had done it. I had broken free, built a life on my own terms, achieved a level of success my family could never have imagined for me. But what came next? For so long, my goal had been escape. Now that I was free, I had to ask myself, what did I want? I had wealth, independence, power, but was that enough? The answer comes in the form of a letter. A week later, a letter arrived at my office. It wasn't from a client. It wasn't from a competitor. It was from a young woman named Elise. She had read about me, followed my work, admired my journey. She wrote about how she had always been told she wasn't good enough, that she should lower her expectations, that she shouldn't dream too big. But seeing what I had done, what I had built, made her believe she could do it too. She wanted advice, guidance, a chance to learn. I read her words twice, my heart pounding in my chest. For so long, my focus had been on proving myself. But maybe it was time to do something more. Maybe it was time to help others rise too. The ultimate victory. Over the next few months, I made a decision. I expanded my business, not just in size, but in purpose. I started mentorship programs for young women in the luxury industry, giving them the tools and knowledge they needed to succeed. I created scholarship opportunities for students interested in art, history, and jewelry authentication, ensuring that talent, not privilege, determined success. I built something bigger than myself. And in doing so, I found something I hadn't expected. Fulfillment. Not the shallow kind that came from proving my family wrong. Not the fleeting satisfaction of a big sale. But the kind that came from knowing I had changed lives. That I had made a difference. That I had created a legacy beyond just wealth. And as I sat in my office, watching my company grow, my influence expand, my impact deepen, I realized something. I had won, not just in business, not just against my family, but in life. Because true success isn't about money, it's about freedom. And I had finally, truly achieved it. A year had passed since I had last spoken to my family. 12 months of absolute silence. No calls, no emails, no surprise visits. At first, I had expected them to try harder, more desperate attempts at manipulation, another round of guilt-laden messages. But after their humiliating confrontation at my office, it seemed they had finally accepted reality. I was no longer theirs to control. The world I had built for myself was untouchable, protected by a fortress of success they couldn't penetrate. And it was beautiful. A life they could never imagine. My business had grown beyond anything I had ever envisioned. What had once been a small, one-woman operation was now a powerhouse in the luxury jewelry industry. My name was synonymous with excellence, my expertise sought after by the wealthiest collectors in the world. Auction houses consulted me before their biggest sales. Celebrities trusted me to authenticate their rarest pieces. Investors relied on my judgment before making million-dollar acquisitions. And beyond that, I had built something that mattered. The mentorship program I had started was thriving, helping young women enter the world of fine jewelry and authentication, an industry once dominated by old money and nepotism. The scholarships I funded had already changed lives, opening doors for students who would have otherwise been overlooked. For the first time, my success wasn't just about me. It was about leaving something behind. A legacy. One that had nothing to do with my family's name. The final attempt. I was in my office, reviewing a potential acquisition for a private collector, when my assistant knocked on the door. Miss Carter, she said carefully, your mother is here. I looked up sharply. Excuse me? She hesitated. She says she just wants to talk. I can have security remove her if you'd prefer. For a moment, I considered it. The easiest choice would have been to have her escorted out, to maintain the silence that had given me so much peace. But something in me, curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the need for closure, made me say, send her in. A minute later, my mother stepped inside. She looked different. Older. More tired. The carefully maintained perfection she had always prided herself on was gone, replaced by deep lines around her mouth and eyes that no longer held the quiet confidence they once did. For a brief second, I felt a flicker of something almost like pity. Almost. She sat down across from me, folding her hands in her lap like she was trying to hold herself together. I didn't say anything. I let the silence stretch, let her sit in the discomfort of a daughter who no longer felt the need to fill the gaps for her. Finally, she spoke. I made mistakes, she said, her voice quieter than I remembered. With you. With everything. I raised an eyebrow. And? She exhaled, looking down at her hands. Your father is sick. It's not serious yet, but we don't know what the future holds. And Sophia, she hesitated. She's struggling. I waited. I already knew where this was going. We just thought, she continued, that maybe it was time to. No. She blinked, clearly not expecting the interruption. Olivia, No, I repeated, my voice calm, unwavering. I already gave you my answer a year ago. A flicker of frustration crossed her face, the old entitlement surfacing. You can't just cut us out forever. I tilted my head. I can, and I have. Her lips pressed together. We're still your family. I let out a quiet, humorless laugh. You remember that now, do you? When I was an afterthought. When my achievements were ignored. When I was sent away over and over again, like I didn't matter. I shook my head. You only see me as family when you need something. Her face twisted. That's not true. It is, I said. You just don't like hearing it. Silence. Then, more softly, she said, you've changed. I smiled. I have. And I wasn't sorry for it. She sat there for a moment longer, as if trying to find the right words to break me down, to guilt me back into submission. But I wasn't that girl anymore. Finally, she sighed and stood. I hope you never regret this, she murmured. I met her gaze, unflinching. I won't. She turned and walked out. And just like that, it was over. The last goodbye. I didn't watch her leave. I didn't feel the urge to run after her, to fix things, to offer some part of myself in the hope that she would finally love me the way I had once wanted. Because I didn't need it anymore. I was free. Truly, completely free. That night, I stood in my penthouse, looking out over the glittering city skyline, and felt something settle in my chest. A quiet kind of peace. Not the desperate kind, the kind you chase because you're running from something. The real kind. The kind that comes when you know, deep in your bones, that you have built something entirely on your own. The kind that comes when you know you owe nothing to the people who once made you feel like you were invisible. True victory. The next morning, I woke up to an email from one of my mens, Elise. I just got offered a position at the auction house. I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you, Olivia. Truly. I smiled. This was what mattered. Not proving myself to people who had never cared. Not chasing after a family who had never valued me. But creating something bigger than myself. Helping others find their own freedom. Building a life that was truly, fully mine. And as I closed my laptop and walked into the day, I knew one thing for certain. I had one. Not because I was rich. Not because I was powerful. But because, for the first time in my life, I was truly free.